Hello, everybody. My name is Jonathan Goodhand, and welcome to this first event of the seminar series. I'm a professor in conflict and development studies at SOAS, and this is the first seminar in the series entitled Frontiers, Illicit Flows and Geographies of Uneven Development. And this is the first of 6 seminars co-convened by the Centre for the Study of Illicit Economies at SOAS and the Conflict and Terrorism Research Group at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, on illicit economies, violence and development. Just 3 kind of housekeeping points to start with. The session itself is going to be recorded. Please turn off your videos and mute your microphones, and please select speaker view. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes introducing the series and the session, and then to introduce our 2 speakers, and then we'll go into a conversation. So this is a seminar series on illicit economies and violence. And we believe that these are crucial issues in terms of understanding today's development landscape. Whether we're talking about drug economies, human trafficking, illegal logging, or the trafficking or the trade in illicit commodities, we think these illicit economies are deeply entangled in so-called illicit development processes, and they can be central to the dynamics of wealth creation, exclusion, and immiseration. And they connect the borderlands of Afghanistan with investments and property developments in Dubai and London and elsewhere. So we're interested in how illicit economies are connected to wider processes of development and state building. And we're interested in how different forms of violence are deeply embedded in these processes. And we want to explore how the impacts of policy and interventions around illicit flows and managing these flows impacts on development processes. And we hope across the 6 sessions we'll generate some interesting conversations between academics, researchers, policymakers, and practitioners. So do please come along to the 6 sessions, and we'll circulate details if you haven't seen what they're about. But now to get on with the session itself. So the aim of this session is to map out some of the intellectual terrain that we're hoping to be covering in this series through a conversation with 2 leading academics who have played a very significant role in this field. We're focusing today on frontier regions, in part because they are key hubs, transshipment points and trading corridors for vibrant illicit economies. But we also think that studying the edges, by doing so, we can learn something more broadly about how states and markets function in the contemporary era. Far from being residual and disconnected, they're often hyper-connected zones of rapid change and innovation. And we think that to study the edges, we need to better understand how people live and survive and sometimes prosper in these frontier zones. And we also want to understand how frontiers and borderlands are connected to metropolitan centres, how these integrative processes generate uneven geographies of development. So that's just a little bit about today's session. I want to introduce our 2 speakers and then get on with the conversation. So Michael, who's over in California, and Dolly, who's in Melbourne, I think 3 o'clock in the morning. So thank you very much for joining us. Michael Watts is a professor emeritus at the University of California, Berkeley. Many of you, particularly those that are linked to SOAS, will be very familiar with his work. At the center of his research is a long-standing engagement with the political economy of development, and in particular, energy and political economy of development, in particular, energy and agro-food sectors in Africa. He's particularly interested in the intersections between political economy, culture, and forms of power. Now, it's impossible here to reference the vast body of work that Michael has generated over the years, but I just want to signpost 3 things that have been very influential in terms of our thinking around illicit economies and frontiers. Firstly, his seminal book, Silent Violence, which has been obviously very widely cited, and a kind of about agrarian crises and famine in Nigeria. His work on frontiers, in particular feasible developments on authority, precarity, and insurgency. And finally, a very recent book chapter entitled Hyper-Extractivism and Global Oil Assemblages, Visible and Invisible Networks in Frontier Spaces. So I hope we'll get a chance to discuss some of this work in the conversation. Secondly, Dolly Kikon is a senior lecturer at the Anthropology and Development Studies program at the University of Melbourne. In fact, for a while, I was a colleague of hers at Melbourne. She's the Deputy Associate Dean in the Institute of India and at the Faculty of the Arts, and a Senior Research Advisor at the Australia-India Institute in Melbourne. Her work focuses on the political economy of extractive resources, militarization, migration, development initiatives, gender relations, food cultures, and human rights. And I'm going to cut it short a bit here because we need to get on with the conversation, Dolly. But I think to point out here how incredibly productive she's been in recent years. She's authored or co-authored 4 books, and just 2 to kind of highlight here: Living with Oil and Coal, Resource Politics and Militarization in Northeast India, and Ceasefire City, Militarism, Capitalism and Urbanism in Dimapur. And I think it's also important to point out that Dolly is an academic, but she's also got training as a human rights lawyer, and she's an activist from India, and she originates from Nagaland. So she comes from the frontier spaces, from the borderlands. So we're very lucky with our 2 speakers today. They are at very different stages in their career. They come from different disciplinary backgrounds, and they study different parts of the world. But I think what connects them both is, first of all, that they challenge and transgress disciplinary boundaries. Their work shows a commitment to empirical research in different frontier spaces, Nagaland and Nigeria in particular. They engage with frontier lives and livelihoods in very compelling ways, and they seek to tell a wider theoretically informed story about the connections between frontiers and development. So we're now going to jump into our conversation, which will be around 50 minutes. Please put in questions in the chat box, and then we'll have 30 minutes for question and answers. So Michael, Dolly and I have had a bit of a conversation about the questions we might ask. I'm sure there'll be lots of divergences along the way and some interesting detours on questions we haven't thought of. But the first question I asked them is, how and why did you become interested in frontiers? And can you say something about your recent work and thinking in relation to frontiers? So maybe, Michael, if you wanted to get started with that, and then ask Dolly to give some reflections in relation to that question.
For organizing this wonderful event, and especially for Dolly, who's agreed to participate at some hideous hour in Australia. So, yeah, thinking about how and why frontiers. In my own case, I guess I thought there were 3 sorts of things that led me toward frontiers. One was, for many years, I've taught a course on peasant economies and peasant societies at Berkeley. And a canonical text for me in that course was this wonderful book by Anton Bloch called The Mafia of a Sicilian Village, a magnificent sort of historical conjunctural analysis of trying to explain why it was that the mafia arose in Western Sicily in the middle of the 19th century. And I had students read that against Gramsci's Southern Question. And of course, what came out of those sorts of readings was the idea, in a way, that the mafia arose at a time of deep class conflict, at a time of commercialization of the Sicilian economy, in which state power and authority was in question in post-Risorgimento Italy. And this seemed to me to sort of resonate with a lot of the work that we've been also reading on Latin American cattle frontiers. And I'm sure some of the participants are familiar with the work of John Markoff, where he talks about frontiers in terms of the limits of central power, where he says that authority is, quote, neither secure nor non-existent. That seemed to me to be a lovely way of thinking about frontiers. A second is, I'm a geographer, and a frontier is a part of our geographical lexicon. But again, I always felt that it was sort of underexplored by geographic spatial theory. In part, I think in the US, because the frontier comes with a lot of historical baggage. You know, the opening of the West, George Frederick Jackson Turner, famous late 19th century article about how it was the frontier that forged American identity, nationalism, capitalism, individualism, etc. I mean, all of that stuff has been debunked. Greg Grandin's new book, or recent book, The End of the Myth, goes through that. But it seemed to me there were ways of rethinking the frontier, using, for example, for me anyway, thinking of the work of someone like Henri Lefebvre. What does it mean to say that a frontier is a type of social space? What are the qualities of frontierness? And then just the last thing, very briefly, is just to say that, you know, I spent a lot of time thinking about oil and gas and extraction. And in the oil and gas industry, frontier has a set of technical meanings that turn on, of course, land and verticality and all of that, but it's also about the quality of the oil reservoir itself and how these qualities change over time, etc. And it seemed to me that that was a rich way of also exploring frontiers, but also doing more than that technical definition. And of course, in any case, that oil literature was so bound up with the resource curse, Paul Collier's work, all of that stuff, which seemed to me to be very limited in how it might think about frontiers. So for all of those reasons, these are the sorts of things, at least, that drew me toward rethinking about frontiers of various sorts.
Thanks, Michael. I'm sure some of those things we'll want to come back to. But, Dolly, do you want to kind of say something about your own?
Sure, Jonathan. Thank you so much for having me here. And I'm seriously very excited to learn from Michael more than anything, you know, more than hearing my voice. But I come from the frontiers. I was born there. I was raised in Nagaland. And I grew up hearing about the region that I come from, the northeastern part of India, which shares I think the maximum number of international, you know, borders, whether with China or with Myanmar, with Bangladesh, and being always, I think, categorized as both, you know, and underdeveloped, you know, community or you know, somebody who came from an underdeveloped region. And kind of it really influenced me both at a personal level and as a thinker. Why is it that certain parts of the world are forever developing, right, but yet can never get out of it? So as I became interested to think about these questions, I began to think about, I think, frontiers as a zone of exploration, you know, constantly being explored. And in grad school, one of the books that really influenced my thinking was Anna Tsing's work. You know, for the first time, in a sense, I was really reading about these zones, which was also extremely well written, amazingly well written, and also being very alive, and, you know, being a zone where so much happens. From the northeastern part of India, we are actually never taken so seriously, both as thinkers and writers or as researchers. And that was the case for the longest time, till I came across amazing writings by, I think, academics and by thinkers, you know, Michael's work included. And so one of the things that began to shape, I think, my thinking was, why is it that a region like the Northeast is constantly not only, I think, perceived as a zone of exploration, but also as a space of speculation? And I think this started in the period of colonization. It took me back to my own people's history, the Naga people, where they were banned from trading in cotton, you know, after the British imposed taxation. The people in that region were actually also banned from trading in salt because the, you know, Britishers imposed taxation. And it was also around the time when oil was discovered. I think the northeastern region of India, Digboy, where oil was quote unquote discovered in 1879, has been recorded as Asia's oldest, I think, oil rig and oil exploratory sites. So I come from a region which is also very, very dynamic, very growing. And it was really also books like Illicit Flows, written by William N. Shandell, and E.T. Abraham, which began to influence me. I think it's a book written in 2005, really, really kind of like showing me that creative zone. But more than that, I think as a thinker and as a writer, for me, I see myself as a frontier citizen. And for me, the frontier is not a frontier as a thinker and as a writer. It is the center of the world to analyze and to conceptualize and to see where we are going, I think, as citizens. The other thing that I wanted to now focus is actually relating to my recent work and in relation to frontiers. If my first ethnographic, I think, academic text was Living with Oil and Coal, right now I'm really exploring food. And in some way, I think it also kind of like follows Michael's work on silent violence, about how food economies are so central because it is then related to land. And this is a region where you're really looking at the intersections of slash and burn June cultivation, where land is also undergoing a transformation, because majority of the landscapes, if you look at the uplands, are slowly being turned into either cash crop plantations like palm oil, or along Manipur into poppy fields. And I think this is also a time when we're looking at how the slash and burn mountaintop food areas are slowly in a way being, mixed with certain kind of quote unquote illicit food products and commodities. So maybe I'll stop here.
Thanks. We're definitely reading similar literatures, so, and we might want to come back to some of those. But maybe we should zoom in a bit now into the frontier spaces that you've been studying. And I guess there's two things that we want to explore here: how frontiers are important in their own right, and they're inherently worthy of study, but also, as Michael talked about Grandin, he says it also, they tell us a lot about broader process of violence and state building, and as safety valves and various other kind of functions. I wonder if we could, both of you could kind of say something about why studying frontiers can tell us something about broader processes of violence and state building. And it's a big question, I know, but if you want to kind of zoom in with some examples from your own research and reflect upon that, what does the study of frontiers tell us about these bigger kinds of things that are going on? So, Michael, do you want to kind of get?
Yeah, sure. I'll say a few words about that. It's a big question. Let me just say that it was fascinating to me listening to Dolly's remarks, because it sort of endorsed what I was trying to clumsily say, which is that if we think about frontiers as particular types of social spaces, then a number of things follow from that. And Dolly made this very clear. In a sense, there are zones of accumulation, often violent, primitive. There are zones of speculative activity. There are zones of particular life forms. They have their own discursive qualities. They're represented in particular types of ways. And not least, they're also not linear phenomena, by which I mean that it's perfectly clear, Grandin makes this point, but others make it too, that it's not as if frontiers, as it were, open up and somehow subsequently close. They may never close, or they may close and reopen. And the temporal component is important. So all of those things I took from what Dolly was saying, and it seems to me they're central as a way of thinking about your question, Jonathan, about how they, in a sense, contribute to how we think about state building, because all of those things are at work. In a sense, it's sort of saying then, well, and here I got this from another French scholar, Lucien Febvre. I don't know if any of your participants have read his wonderful essay on frontiers, where he says that particular states produce particular frontiers. And it seems to me that that's a nice way of thinking about the state building question, because central to that, it seems to me, we need to think about the sorts of circumstances under which qualities of frontierness contribute or not to particular types of institution building or particular forms of authority. Often in frontier zones, there's a certain type of elasticity to the rule of law, ditto property rights. If you take, for example, Jeremy Campbell's wonderful book, Conjuring Property, discussing property rights in Amazonia, on the Amazonian frontiers, a wonderful example of that. If you think, for example, about how, again, if I'm invoking Markov here, he says that frontiers always have classes of intermediaries, classes specialized in expediency, he says, whose only commitment is to preserve the order that made it possible for profitable utilization. What are those class configurations and their cultural forms? That's why I was so influenced by Anton Bloch's work on the mafia, a cultural form, violent forms of accumulation, also forms of upward mobility, classes engaged in forms of political expediency, the notion of institutional patchiness, that there are unevennesses in some way about these qualities of state building. I've also been sort of influenced, and incidentally, my old student, Theo Balvet, his wonderful book, Frontier Effect, shows how, in fact, institution building and forms of authority can be built under these rough and tumble circumstances of state building. Deborah Yashar's work, Homicidal Ecologies, fantastic account of homicidal violence across the Americas, focusing on the intersection of forms of state capacity and forms of, in a sense, criminal competitive organization that produces particular, what she calls territorial enclaves of violence. Again, and this will take different forms in different places given these different combinations of what she calls organizational competitiveness and state capacity. Let me just say one last thing, which I didn't make clear at the beginning. Why I think Lefebvre is useful for frontiers is that it gets us out of the jam of thinking that frontiers are phenomena exclusively of the global south. All of my recent work has been exactly the reverse, doing comparative work on frontiers that reads a global south frontier against something else. And I just want to flag here, we can talk about it when we have time. But here for me, Vadim Volkov's book on post-Soviet Russia, the collapse of authority there, violent entrepreneurs, demonstrated so clearly that even in the context of, quote, modern, centralized, in this case, party state systems of that sort, they can take on, in the context of either the withdrawal or collapse of the state, the limits of political authority and legitimacy, frontier-like qualities, in which all manner of these forms that we've been talking about, violent accumulation, post-Soviet mafias can emerge. I'll stop there.
Listening to that last point, Mike, I'm reminded of Lund's work, and who talks about frontiers as less a space than a dynamic. And
exactly.
Exactly. I'm thinking about the work of one of my research students on militias in Rio, and
absolutely,
how that landscape is divided into frontier-like spaces.
Absolutely. And they are, sorry, just to say that we don't want, for me as a geographer, I don't want to abandon the spatial content of it. They're not only spatial. That's the Lefebvrean social space angle. But they can be, and often are, deeply territorialized in the way that you described. And Dolly's work is a wonderful example of that in her coal and oil book.
So Dolly, over to you now.
Okay, what the studying frontiers tell us about the process of development and state building, that one of the things that I learned, and I've always learned through perhaps like lived experiences, coming from a region like Northeast India, and slowly perhaps like going into Bhutan and Nepal and Bangladesh, looking at South Asia as such. But it's so fascinating for me to listen to, I think, Michael and about how the frontier is taught. For me as a student, I got perhaps like thinking about the frontier, not perhaps from frontier literature because I found it too intimidating and at times quite abstract because because the terms and the concepts were so clear and were so categorized neatly that as somebody looking at quote unquote frontiers, I began really to look at perhaps the colonial experience of how certain spaces, regions became frontiers. And for me, it was a more comforting and a more dialogical space, that perhaps maybe nurtured empathy and also curiosity and generosity. And I think one of the persons who helped me think about frontier was really a historian, Ajay Skaria's work on wilderness. Right, so because this constant struggle with why is it that people from the frontiers are never civilized, they can never develop, they can never become perfect citizens. And I think those were the questions that I was beginning to deal with. The other scholar who really helped me kind of like get into the zone of understanding colonization and landscape was William Cronin's work, also kind of, and it's a really different landscape, the North American landscape, shifting perhaps from a region like the northeastern frontiers of India in South Asia to another settler colonial space, but actually understanding the history of violence and dispossession was really central and crucial. The third person who really began to make sense for me, true bodily lived experience, was Gloria Anzaldua's work on not frontier, but the idea of the border and the borderland. And how is it that this space can be a frontier, maybe for geographers and maybe for anthropologists, but it's a zone of deeply securitized, militarized space for, let's say, the Indian Army or for people looking at the war on drugs. So maybe for me to look at understanding frontiers and spaces of development and state building, begin to open that up. I strongly believe that frontiers are really kind of black holes of development. You bring in any amount of money, you may bring in any kind of programs, it really begins to, I think, have a life of its own. So in a sense, it also is like what I think James Ferguson's work, Anti-Politic Machine, would tell us. But I think more so in terms of state building, these are extremely violent spaces. So for instance, in the northeastern frontiers of India, something like the Armed Forces Special Spar Act, right? Beginning in 1958, it's really an extra constitutional regulation that gives the Indian Armed Forces the right to kill and have impunity over it. How can that coexist, let's say, with a deeply, deeply extractive economy started in the 19th century? How is it that, for me, the frontiers, like the northeastern region of India, continues to define citizens as recalcitrant, as suspicious? So for me, Jonathan, more than looking at goods and commodities from the licit and illicit point of view, first, actually, it's the citizens, the indigenous, the marginalized, who are constantly being defined as suspicious, as recalcitrant. And how is it, imagine, right? Contradictions like development, civilizational programs are being mapped on their bodies and their homelands and their villages. And what does it mean for people living in those frontier spaces? One of the things that I've learned, studying a space like the northeastern region of India in the last 2 decades, is really the resilience and the adaptability of it. And all of a sudden, when citizens, really indigenous communities, become adaptable, whether it's Michael saying that, how do you make money? Right? How do you survive? So one of the things that I began to actually move away when I was doing my fieldwork, doctoral fieldwork, which became living with oil and coal, was really looking at not that how can I say, those resistance, those movements against oil exploration, but the poorest of the poor really stuck in a violent cycle, right, of exploitation, but at the same time of survival. So how do we, as thinkers, as academics, or maybe as policymakers, understand those bits and pieces? I think those are really key for me.
So I think maybe Michael will want to come back on some of these things, but I think this point that you make, Dolly, about when you look at people's lives and livelihoods in these frontier spaces, these boundaries between licit and illicit, legal and illegal, become quite meaningless. and certainly the work we've been doing, people involved in drug economies, they were involved in so-called illicit practices, and there's entanglements between them. But I wonder if we could, Michael started off by talking about states and how states produce or productive of particular kind of frontiers. Maybe we could look a bit at the development and economic practices in these spaces. And often frontiers are talked about as though they have a comparative advantage in inequality. The particular sets of practices tend to be germane in these spaces. So I wonder, Mike, particularly your work around oil, but other forms of kind of livelihoods in these spaces, if you could kind of elaborate a little bit there and link it to development processes more broadly.
Yeah. Before I do that, I just wanted to follow up on some of those wonderful comments by Dolly. This issue, for example, of how frontier spaces are often deeply militarized. You, Dolly, use, I think in your coal book, you referred to militarized carbon landscapes. This is particularly in the case of something like oil, and this is as true, incidentally, in Texas as it is in Nigeria. They are deeply militarized and securitized and surveyed in all sorts of ways. That makes a lot of sense to me. At the same time that they obviously can be, and I pose this as a question we might want to explore. They can be and often are deeply violent for all the reasons that Dolly just walked through. But I think, as well, I've come to think about frontiers comparatively, is that one, those violences can take a whole multiplicity of forms in terms of the questions of forms of life that we're now talking about. But under some circumstances, they need not be violent, at least violent in the context of the types of physical conflicts that we often see in these rough and tumble sorts of zones. So I just wanted to posit that question of I don't think necessarily assuming that these spaces, by virtue of their frontierness, are always violent. And I guess just to round this out, that's partly why in the recent work that I've been looking at, I've been studying the global commodity trading houses, the Koch brothers, Trafigura, Mercuria, and so on. These are these massive, often privately held companies that operate in frontier zones in at least two senses, often in those areas buying and selling commodities of the sort of Nagaland, Nigeria sort. But a big part of their activities are, of course, through offshore tax havens and such other spaces, which are also classically frontier, without necessarily their qualities of frontierness. It seems to me don't necessarily flop into the types of physical and other violences that we've seen in parts of the global south. So I just wanted to make that point. Just very briefly, it seems to me Dolly's work on the question of forms of social life that inhabit or that are generated in these frontier zones is so much more sophisticated than my own. And I think that's probably, Dolly, your anthropological expertise, which I don't have, to be able to wonderfully document that. I just want to make one point. I've tried to focus in on one aspect of that social life, and particularly the life of young men, of youth, and the very real possibility in such zones as you've described with that colonial heritage, Dolly, of what I've called, and this is a clumsy way of talking about it, of living outside of authority. When the state, local government, chieftainship, non-profits, all of these forms of what I would call public authority are so illegitimate and or corrupt, or from which the political process, young men are excluded. They don't have those citizenship rights you were talking about, Dolly. That there's a level at which then young men in these oil zones can be, as it were, excluded from, propelled out of, alienated from these forms of authority. And what does it mean to be a young man who might aspire in a sort of heteronormative sense of wanting to get married and have kids? There are patterns of upward mobility, culturally shaped, what does it mean when that is blocked off for you because of your precarity? Here I've been influenced by Judy Butler's work, of course, how she thinks about precarity, exclusion from social infrastructure, she said. Well, that's what that category of youth then, living outside of that authority. I've tried to sort of capture or think about existentially what social forms of life that entails, in which a part of it, I think, my last point, I'll shut up, is it represents, again, I use this language delicately, a type of crisis of masculinity, that cultural forms of what it means to be masculine and forms of gendered mobility or status can be compromised. And I've tried to explore those in a variety of ways, but it seems that's as best as I can, apropos your question, Jonathan, which was about the frontier life as a type of life form, as Foucault might say. That's what I've focused on and tried to get a handle on that little sliver, very small sliver of frontier life.
Dolly, do you want to pick up on some of that? Because your work is very much just focused on gender change, gender relations, and
Yes. Wow. I was just listening to Michael, and I'm learning so much. So I think I've not much to add here, and so I'm thinking about how, in what ways do illicit economies shape processes of I think of development, and what insights does a focus on the illicit offer. I would definitely say that in frontier spaces we focus maybe on illicit economies, but the 19th century, in the region where I work, clearly shows that the illicit was also such, I think colonial definitions and categories, where not only with commodities and goods, but also human spaces and communities being defined. In Assam, I think I would like to refer to the historian Jaita Sharma's work, where she Empire's Garden, a beautiful book, where she clearly shows that even categories and definitions of an entire community like the Assamese people, as lazy, right? As lazy and absolutely, community who would refuse to work in the tea plantations came up. So this kind of, I think, categories, still stick and exist. I think in terms of perhaps looking at then, illicit economies and development, I feel that it's really central, especially in frontier spaces. Definitely picking up on what Michael was saying. Definitely not all frontier spaces are violent, but those frontier spaces take on this entire conversations about insecurity, illicit, and the fear, right? The fear of the dark, in a sense, to inform and regulate governance, and how everyday governance and how citizens should be controlled and governed. For instance, the northeastern region of India is deeply impacted by the Golden Triangle, the drug Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia. And in the middle of the pandemic around 2021, you can imagine India's gone, into a shutdown. There's Omicron everywhere. And in the city of Guwahati, which is really the hub, they call it the gateway city, the frontier city of Northeast India, where you have the maximum number of airplanes flying in, the train routes all directed at Guwahati, with a population of around 1 million. You had a new government come up, under the BJP government, and between June 4th and May 10 and June 4th, we are actually looking at around 3 weeks. The government comes up and trying to prove what is good governance in the middle of the pandemic, actually declares that there's a drug war in that state of Assam. And between that period of 3 weeks, you can imagine, you have 342 cases registered in police stations. Jonathan, understanding the Indian legal system and how difficult it is actually to file even a FIR, a first information report, you can imagine the madness that's happening. The hospitals are packed with people. The death rates in India, and especially also across Northeast India, is crazy. And you have a drug war going on there. It's really a government policy in a way, I think, to control and in a way to dominate politics. And with 342 cases, imagine 3 weeks in the middle of this, one of the most horrifying lockdowns, you have 596 arrests made on peddlers, on drug users, and all of them are pushed inside prisons. And so I think the madness that happens clearly shows us that whether it's the state of Assam or Manipur or Nagaland, Mizoram, there's a conversation that's happening. Mizoram and Manipur shares a really distinct border with Myanmar, which is part of the golden triangle. And one of the things that I want to also really figure out here is that we talk about illicit, and Jonathan, you rightly say about the boundaries, the blurry boundaries. We're talking really about here opium and poppies, right? Where indigenous communities, even like the Nagas, the Singpos, have used it as medicinal. But in the 19th century, the Britishers definitely look at it as through the commercial lens. I'll just give you a statistics that in the district of Churachandpur in Manipur, which borders Myanmar, between 2017 and 2020, close to 5,000 acres of poppy fields were destroyed. And here we're also talking about the destruction of small factories and all. So one of the points perhaps that I want to focus on is, like, rightly so, in many cases, we're really not looking at violence as such, but everyday regulation, I think, and governance. But the northeastern region of India is really distinct in a sense. And like Michael says, certain frontiers are absolutely not studied or perceived from the framework of violence, and some are. So perhaps that's where the northeastern region of India falls, as very, very violent landscapes. And how do we deal with these flows? Yeah.
Jonathan, may I just follow up on what very briefly on one point here? Hearing you speak, Dolly, it occurs to me, of course, that one of the aspects of frontierness that is embodied in what you just said is that these are social spaces that attract a great deal of prescriptive, normative attention, precisely to discipline them. States want to discipline them. Capital wants to discipline them. Advocacy groups want to discipline them, precisely because of all the bad stuff, the poor governance that is, as it were, discursively constructed around them. And I wonder whether we might want to talk a little bit about then the various types of instruments and modalities that are, as it were, put to service in that goal. I mean, I work on oil and gas, and of course you have this enormous business now devoted to this. You think of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, EITI, but there are many. Even the wonderful work of certain advocacy organizations are all in the business, as it were, of transparency and accountability. I'd love to have some discussions around those types of instruments as they are put to work, in what particular ways, to, as the old saying goes, to shine light into the darkness of these corrupt institutions. I mean, the whole domain of corruption itself is so imbricated in the ways in which frontiers are constituted. But the larger issue there, Jonathan, you've worked on this much more than I, but that type of prescriptive policy world and how they see, in some sense, the demands of working, of disciplining these zones. To say nothing, of course, of large capital and its reputational concerns with all manner of crises that emerge because of collusion with, complicity with corrupt politicians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That seems to me to be, in a sense, deeply attached to these frontier spaces as we've been talking about them.
I wonder if you'd like to come back on that, Dolly. I mean, what we're listening to you speak there, Michael, something that we are in our research are kind of playing around with a little bit, is to kind of turn James Scott's idea on its head, that the states are kind of engaging these spaces to make them more legible and therefore more governable. And often what we see is the opposite, is actually states on maintaining these liminal spaces because it's functional. And citizens living there want to become more legible so they can make claims on the state. I mean, that's obviously simplifying things massively, but it's, you know, what interests are there in kind of maintaining these kinds of these zones of kind of states of exception and liminality? So I mean, you've kind of been looking at this at the sharp end, Dolly. I wonder what, because a lot of your work actually is about making borderland societies more legible through your legal work, isn't it? In some respects.
That's interesting. I don't know about legibility, because I always claim that the frontier is really the center of the world, for me to think about and to theorize. And I would like to also say that, especially in South Asia and in India, if you look at the northeastern region of India where I work, it's been really central in shaping the idea of both right to self-determination, sovereignty, the literature on armed conflict and security in India is really shaped by regions like Northeast India and Kashmir. So let's not, I think, forget how these frontier spaces, zones of violence have been very, very productive spaces to think about it. But when it comes to real spaces, I think we'll also be talking about policy and policy making. The thinkers and the writers looking at these spaces and putting them as key areas to think about, I think needs some more work in terms of perhaps listening to them a little bit more. And I think this is where I would like to maybe come in here and think about instruments and modalities in frontier spaces. And Michael, here I'm referring to your work on hyper extractivism and the global assemblage. And I think you very clearly talk about of course, you're really talking about really huge planetary scopes and scales, but I think the important points, the connectivity, the tension that you touch upon, in this kind of extractive zones, whether it's to do with supply chain related, are really things like manufacturing, finance, logistical, and here, if I may say so in our conversation, really dreams and aspirations as well. And I think that's where the social really becomes alive, right? What do we do about dreams and aspirations? Are the dreams of the poor, let's say in the diamond mines of Angola and the oil rigs, are they not important enough, right? What do we do? And I think this is really where the danger lies, that somehow in this entire conversation about oil being bad for the planet, we, I think, forget the poorest of the poor and who are right there digging under the ground and the lives that they live. There are three things that really came to my mind when you were invoking, I think, this conversation, Michael, about instruments and what happens. There's a term that's become really vibrant in the region where I work, and it's entrepreneurship, right? Every young person has this dream of becoming an entrepreneur. So it may be just growing, even ginger in the uplands. It may be, let's say, working on a de-addiction plan in a small village, which is growing poppy. It may be really about having a development dream to create a self-help group. Everyone has this dream of entrepreneurship. What are they doing, perhaps, to instrumentalize citizens, recalcitrant citizens into good citizens? How do they help? The second point that's really important about frontier spaces are also definitely, because extraction is so key, these are zones like exploration and speculation. And this region that I work falls within the Himalayan landscape. It's one of the biodiversity hotspots of the world. So I think for the longest time, perhaps, frontiers for me as a thinker and a writer have been through the lens of extraction, really maybe erasing the other beings, animals, which are so important because they cross the corridors. And one of the issues really coming up in the oil exploration sites and the tea plantations have been, what do you do about elephants, right? Who are really losing their habitat and have to now go into the oil rig areas, oil exploration areas, and also the tea plantations. So one of the important things that's coming up in these frontier spaces are also conservations. And how do we think about conservation in a deeply extractive landscape, right? It almost sounds like a contradiction, but I think there are some amazing works that are coming up where animals, ecologies, water bodies are really becoming clear. In 2020, when there was an oil spill in Bagjan, which really continues to cause devastations across the landscape in Assam, the moment I read about communities, individuals who lost their homes and their paddy fields, and these are really poor subsistence farmers committing suicide, it really impacted me, because it was really about, a year after my book had come out. So how do we begin to think about that? If we have to think about instruments, modalities now as researchers, I think we have to be deeply engaged working in that landscapes like that. In a very small way, what I tried to do is organize a workshop in December in a university in Assam. So the students, irrespective of what disciplines they are in, they may be in literature, in geography, in political science, at least we can go for a field trip to the Bagjan oil spill areas. And I think that's fair for us, looking at certain terms that governments are offering, like entrepreneurship, like conservation programs, the third definitely being very important, something as infrastructure. What do we do about infrastructure? Constantly crumbling and constantly being built, because we're looking at a very, very fragile geology, which is part of the Himalayas, a very young mountain range. And so I think these are some of perhaps the important things that resonate with me. But at the end, I'm a teacher. And what do? I think my job then is to engage and is to take students to these field sites. And so in December, I'll be taking students to Dibru-Saikia and kind of that oil spill area and see what we can do together. I think that's where maybe we're also really looking at policy and engagement. So in a very rambling way, I'll stop here.
Jonathan, may I again just follow up on Dolly and something that you said, which I hope we have it in the questions can explore. And this is this question of legibility, or what I referred to as disciplining. And you raised the interesting sort of paradox, potential paradox of frontiers, as it were, being intentionally, deliberately, politically being left undisciplined, because it serves all sorts of political and economic and capitalist accumulative interests. I think there's no question about that, but that raises a larger set of questions about frontiers, it seems to me. It could be exactly as you described, but it could be that those frontiers are undisciplined precisely because the state has neither the infrastructural or despotic powers to discipline, in spite of its goal and intention to do that. That seems to me to be a distinct possibility. If I take a look at Nigeria and the Northeast and Boko Haram, it's not clear to me that indeed the Nigerian military, with all of its massive corruption, lack of resources and capability, et cetera, might be an example of a type of failed effort to indeed render legible. And I'm going here because in my own thinking, I've been deeply influenced by Eyal Weizman's extraordinary book, Hollow Land, about Palestine and Israel, where he makes the point, among other things, that under some circumstances, the Israeli state deliberately withdraws its political and security presence, in a sense, creating or deepening frontier-like qualities, knowing full well the extraordinary violence that will be perpetrated against Palestinian and Arab community populations in those zones. So what I'm trying to flag here, it seems to me, is just a variety of ways in which this legibility or disciplining may not be possible despite particular sorts of state capabilities, or may be in fact deliberately deliberately retaining its frontierness for all the sorts of reasons that you're talking about. Again, it seems to me that both of these things are not necessarily contradictory. They're built into what I'm calling these qualities of frontierness. We might want to come back to those later.
If I can just, like, Michael, you're putting it so beautifully, because I think this is where the idea, I think, of maybe like frontierness and disciplining is constant, because the sites which are benefiting from frontier extraction are elsewhere, right? Yeah. That's where the scope and the scale of extractivism needs to go up. And that's what you're doing in your recent work in terms of hyper-extractivism and really the planetary scope of where we have to look for. For instance, so in a small frontier, very, very violent frontier zones like the Northeast, the people who are caught maybe with drugs, or the people who are put to prison and all for let's say illicit activities, are really the small fish. The big fishes are elsewhere, maybe in Delhi, in Bombay, in Gujarat, in Dubai, in Singapore. That's where the money is going. That's where they're really creating their empires, for instance. So I think those kind of scales become really key and important for us to understand. So thank you so much for putting this in perspective.
Thank you very much. And that really kind of brings out this question about uneven developments. And I think it's really, really nice. We haven't got many questions at the moment, but we have, and certainly I can see one, so maybe we should move into Q&A, and some of these things will kind of come back, I'm sure, in our conversation. So the question I'll ask is from Eric Gutierrez, who's actually was part of our Drugs and Disorder project. I'll read it out. It's quite a long question. So Anton Bloch put forward this notion of interdependency, that mafias do not have their own independent structure. They're not an autonomous form or external to the rest of society. They're embedded in society and necessarily engaged or locked in interdependent relationships with state and market actors. Could you share some thoughts on interdependency? Could it be an explanation for unusual outcomes in illicit economies? I guess something just to add on to that is it's a similar kind of concept of brokerage. And that's something that we've been working with quite a lot in our research. Intermediaries who navigate these kind of what Wolf used to talk about as the synapses between the national and the local level, between the centre and the periphery. So any reflections of both of you on this question on interdependency and also on kind of brokerage intermediation?
Dolly, you want to take that one?
I think that question was for you, Michael. So
oh, is it me? Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose Anton Bloch's wonderful book was precisely about the types of class of intermediaries and the way in which, to put it in slightly different language, not interdependence, the way in which mafia-like organizations can capture the state, can take on certain sorts of state functions, certain sorts of security functions, protecting class interests. This is exactly the type of interdependencies that Eric is talking about, which seems to me to be absolutely central to mafia, criminal organizations of various sorts. This is, in fact, central to Deborah Yasher's book, Homicidal Ecologies, where she's looking precisely at what difference it makes when, in fact, there is competition among this class of intermediaries, and how that can actually foment the worst sorts of violences in these frontier spaces, in these territorial enclaves. So I think Eric's point is absolutely right. There's a set of questions here, which I would actually direct to Dolly in part, which is, of course, these are not, if you pose that interdependence, if I think of oil theft in Nigeria or oil theft in Mexico, I've tried to compare these two cases as different types of frontier phenomena. This question of interdependence among cartels or oil mafia and various types of military and state functionaries and business functionaries, to say nothing of the complicity of companies, actually. That's that assemblage where these interdependencies are so key. My question is that, of course, these are bloody difficult to study, and they're probably very dangerous to study. And I'm always admire Dolly when I read her work about the types of those difficulties of working in these what can be quite dangerous and difficult spaces, precisely to get a handle at Eric's interdependencies and how they offer it, what these networks actually look like. So I guess there's a type of ethical, moral, epistemological, practical set of questions about those spaces. And often, in my own case, I mean, I think it's investigative journalism, actually, which often helps us, skills that often academics don't have, incidentally, that are so central. Or alternatively, you know, Paradise Papers, Luanda Gate, these tranches of material that are leaked from various sources. All of this stuff becomes sort of tricky. And if I can just have one last thing here, the worst thing that I did on reflection in terms of those types of practical questions of working in these spaces and getting a feel for these intermediaries was when I was asked to become an expert witness in a federal circuit court case brought against Chevron by 13 villagers from a community in the oil delta in Nigeria who had been shot by Nigerian military. Not them, but their family members had been shot. And I raise that because in a public jury, federal judiciary format, giving one that type of visibility, arguing on behalf of the plaintiffs, meant that whatever limited doors I may have had access in that corporate oil world closed very, very quickly. It was my point being here then is that embedded in that question of intermediaries are a series of interesting questions about how they're explored, yet alone what we can learn from different types of intermediaries, entrepreneurs, call them what you will, brokers in different types of frontier settings.
I was thinking about the term interdependency, and it took me back to June Nasher's work, which really influenced my own work. We eat the mines and the mines eat us, on the Bolivian tin miners. And I think one of the processes that helps me to understand interdependence, intermediaries, is through this work by Sanjeev Barua, political scientist, generals as governors, and how frontier spaces as spaces of governance are often handed over to security people. In India, you have the position of a governor, which is quite a colonial, I think, position, and they have immense authority in frontier regions to decide policies, to decide and implement. So I think, in a sense, across the northeastern region of India, if you look at the position of who is the governor appointed by the federal government, they're often either ex-intelligence officers, head of police, head of army who are sent. And they are sent for a particular reason, because you have to govern the frontier in a very militaristic way. A majority of the managers, the directors, the heads who come to build the dams and also oversee the oil rigs all have military background. They're either from the border security forces, retired as colonels, or as generals. The second part of this interdependency, besides governance, also are surrendered insurgents that I think, Michael, in your own work that you were talking about as well. So insurgents, former insurgents, surrendered insurgents who become managers to oversee infrastructure and oversee this kind of exploration and extraction that goes on. The third kind of interdependence that is there is where we fit in as well as researchers. What kind of information are we looking at? And I think I completely agree with Michael here. Some of the cutting edge report on extraction on frontiers actually are really done by investigative journalists. Thank God for them. As researchers, when we develop an idea, it takes us time. But I think for me in my own life, some of my amazing mentors and friends are journalists. And that's where they really shake me up and put me in my place, both I think for public engagement and to break down this nonsense academic language that I write sometimes. So thank God for those reminders. And I think it's really key for us as researchers as well to have this kind of mentors and friends outside academy who are really doing really core, important, interesting work.
I think we need to move on to another question, but this discussion about the research challenges around this kind of work, around intermediation brokerage, is definitely one to continue. I think there's a lot more to say about it. But there's two questions which are related here. One from Fritz, and it's, could you comment on flexible frontiers? For example, between areas controlled by armed groups in Colombia, many communities are exposed to this frontier state during a short period. How would that affect them differently? I'm reminded of your work on warscapes here, Michael, and the shifting kind of landscapes around frontiers in wartime. And then a related but different question from Power Novak, who's at SOAS. First is thank you for wonderful interventions. And it's a bit of a long question, but I will read it out. My question relates to a series of debates within the field of border studies. And to the expansive conceptualization of borders that has become dominant across the field, a conceptualization that somehow dissolves borders into fluctuating spaces or zones or embodied and mobile lines. I see resonances between this understanding and the conceptualization of frontier spaces that emerges from your conversation, whereby these spaces are sometimes defined in relation to state authority, sometimes to capitalist development, sometimes to the Anglo-Duone queerness that escapes the militarized, excuse my pronunciation, escapes the militarized order of the states. From this perspective, frontier spaces can emerge anywhere from a Latin American borderland to a squat in central London, or for example, to an offshore kind of offshore investment space or whatever. Do you see this expansive conceptualization as posing challenges to research efforts premised on this concept, or do you see this ambiguity as analytically productive? So it's two big kind of questions about how we understand borders and borderlands and these kind of frontier spaces, whether we kind of open it up in this way and whether that's productive. Do you want to have a go on that, Michael?
Yeah, Dolly,
sure,
you should go ahead, Dolly, please.
Okay, let me try.
As we say, this is way above my pay grade, but I will try. I will after you're done.
No, Michael. You're going to give a fantastic answer. I'm going to learn from you. So let me try the first one on flexible frontiers. It reminded me of Ivo Ong's work, Flexible Citizenship. Yeah. And in a way, I think the market, capital, and ethnic mobility are crucial to understand this idea of flexibility. And how do you benefit from there? I think flexibility is really also a term of privilege, which Ivo Ong's work clearly shows. To be a Hong Kong resident and to have multiple passports, right? And we just had this entire Hong Kong movement, and very, very horrifying what happened to citizens. People with different passports could really get on the plane and go to London, get British citizenship. Australia has been very generous to them as well, and so they are open to giving asylum to citizens from Hong Kong, where Australia has one of the biggest detention centers in the world when it comes to other war refugees. And so I think that tells us a lot about the concept of flexibility when it comes to the frontiers. Definitely the rich. The rich, whether it's about Mamdani's work about, who are the tribal elites and what does it mean? They are the ones actually really picking up the language and being extremely articulate as to how the frontier now is defined and categorized, while they can have houses, offshore and really write about such places, which really makes me angry, and not at the same time situate the reality of the people there, because they can take and extract a small vignette and go to London or New York. So that's a kind of a flexible frontier, not only in terms of landscape, but also privilege that we need to be mindful of. The second thing about this amazing question, which is very, very long, and I will completely fail to answer this well, Paulo, but let me try. And let me focus on the question that you have. So do you see expansive conceptualization as posing challenges to research efforts, or do you see this as analytically productive? For me as a thinker and a writer, I seek clarity, right? And I think when we are clear about visions and concepts and analytical frameworks, I think that's where we are, I think, politically most productive. If we look at our engagement and forms of writing as political spaces. So looking at border studies, something very new, and definitely the northeastern region of India has been very vibrant in this thing that's come up called borderland studies. It's an initiative by a Dutch scholar, Willem van Schandel, that I deeply respect. But how do we look at border studies? How do we look at frontier spaces? Because you refer to Anzaldua and also queerness, I think as a feminist anthropologist and a feminist writer itself, I think they signify two different ontological and epistemological, maybe, frameworks. Border, what is a border? What is the margin, about bodies and all? I think really important and key to understand. But when it comes to frontier, maybe we're really looking at capital, we're really looking at exploration, we're really looking at extractivism. So maybe these are themes that we can continue to have conversations with, but borders, frontiers, I think maybe means different things, looking at different perspectives. If you ask security studies guy, he or she or they will give you a completely different answer. But for us working in those spaces, how do we look at it? And I think a feminist gender framework is really important and useful here.
Michael.
All right, a couple of things. Just on this flexibility question, what highlighting flexibility about frontiers does for me is it, and I'm thinking here particularly about some of the work that I've been doing on these commodity trading houses and this offshore world, is that it demonstrates, to come back to something we've already talked about, this porosity between the legal and illegal, the licit and the illicit. Because it seems to me in these, for example, offshore spaces, it's not as if that the types of conditions that are there for foreign capital to operate there are in any simple sense illicit. All sorts of illicit and legal things may happen there, but the types of incentives and spaces have been set up by rule of law. But of course, what that shows more than anything else is that the rule of law itself is a projection of political power. It's as socially constructed as is, in fact, the illicit. So it seems to me that that's coming back to something that I think has been central to our discussions, is when we posit this binary of licit and illicit, we have to be attentive to this sort of porosity, the fact that these intermediaries and these brokers are precisely trucking in that porosity, you might say. That's one. Yeah, Paolo's question is a tough one. And I'm not sure what to say, except I approach the frontier, Paolo, from a pretty clunky vantage point conceptually. I was deeply influenced by Bob Jessup's book on the state, theorizing the state. And as you probably know, he has this language, formal and substantive, for talking about particular qualities of stateness. But what he concludes from that is that, as he puts it, the territorial control, operational unity, and political authority of the state is always a practical and contingent achievement. In other words, built into all states, given the types of function and instrumentalities of all states, that's the conditions that produce frontiers are always possible by virtue of the contingent nature of state authority and power. That's how so in that sense, my doubtless flawed way of thinking about frontiers is deeply state-centric or state-centered. Now, where am I going with this? I'm not as familiar as Dolly is with the border literature, but I have read Mazadra's book, Border as Method, very carefully. And it seems to me the challenge that comes out there is as much a challenge for me as for all of us, which is that, are we now invoking frontiers and borders in such a abstract and generic way that everything's a border, everything is a frontier? I remember Andrew Sayre had a wonderful term for talking about concepts of that sort. Maybe you can remember, Jonathan or Dolly. Did he call it undisciplined concepts or unruly concepts or something? So there's always a danger, then, it seems to me, of in some sense making a concept sufficiently flexible or capacious that it loses an edge, and that's why for me that edge is provided by that state reference, by its reference to the qualities of states in general under capitalism. That's not a sufficient answer in any way to the great question, but I take it to be a serious one for this whole series you have, actually, Jonathan, which is, the problem of overgenerality. Everything's bloody neoliberalism. Oh yeah, give me an issue, it's neoliberal. It loses a certain intellectual, conceptual, theoretical rigor. And I think that's what I took Paolo was trying to say for us. Are we stumbling into that area? I just leave it there.
Thank you. We're running out of short of time. There's two questions for Dolly. I'm not sure we'll have time for both of them, but because I would like at the end, if any kind of final reflections and thoughts from Dolly and Michael before we wrap up. So we've got 10 minutes. So Dolly, there's a question here. There are many big oil companies like Alpha Geotech companies, Oil India, PBT, in India trying to extract hydrocarbon from Manipur. And as part of the Northeast Hydrocarbon Vision 2030. As of now, it hasn't happened yet. Do you believe it will actually happen in the future? And why do we need to study about this right now for something which hasn't happened yet? There was another question here. It says for Dolly, but it says, Mr. Watts mentions the distinct possibility of state deliberately abstaining from implementing actual measures that are within their powers to do so in frontiers. You also question whether states like Nigeria, with all its military powers, can really stabilize its frontiers. As someone hailing from Northeast India, do you concur with this perspective on the matter specifically for North India? So I don't know if you want to try and you may want to just pick one of those questions, Dolly, but also if and then any kind of concluding thoughts from both of you, any reflections on the conversation and where we've got to in this conversation before we have to wrap up. So are you okay to start, Dolly?
Definitely, Jonathan. I'll be very brief, and I think I'll pick up from where Michael left in terms of really having that, being cautious of generalizations, and one thing that allows us to see, we have something called the Border Security Force, and we have something called the Northeast Frontier Railways as well. So imagine both things exist in the region like Northeast, with a term like border, with a term like frontier. I think it gives us a lot of insight into how spaces and regions transform. Plants, because we're coming back to drugs, opium, poppies and all, they really don't care for borders, neither do animals. That's why even security people begin to use terms like corridors for animals, and for plants, maybe invasive species, pests, right? So I think these terms, the different terminologies that come, allow us to really be very conceptually creative. The other thing about, exactly, I think this question is an answer to the previous one, right? Why do we need to study things which are not happening? And that's exactly what frontiers allow us to do, to speculate. Right. The Himalayas today is known as the pharmacy of the world, and there is a speculation, and on speculation people buy lands, and they develop rules and regulations so that corporations and companies can come and take over lands, including indigenous lands and forests. I think that tells us a lot about the character of the frontier. And the other thing about, I think very quickly, as somebody hailing from Northeast India, what happens? Puram, thank you. We have an extra constitutional regulation known as the Armed Forces Special Spar Act, and we have been campaigning for the repeal of this for decades together. People have lost their lives, and definitely I think when it comes to the northeastern region of India, that's very distinct. The other complexity that we have in a frontier like Northeast India is also the unfinished business of colonization, which is a very, very deeply incomplete process of decolonization. And so the claim for the right to self-determination is really a key and a living movement. Right now, the government of India has several ceasefire agreements officially recognized by the federal government in India with many insurgent groups. And I think for us as researchers looking at frontier spaces like that, we need to be more, I think, engaged and in a way keyed into how it plays into the future of the region. Thank you.
Thanks, Dolly. Michael.
Well, I'll just say two things. One, I'll start with something that Dolly said right at the beginning, which is that, I'm paraphrasing her words, that the frontier is the world, or something of that sort, from her vantage point. And I'm sympathetic to that view, in part because my old student, or at least someone who I worked with closely at Berkeley, Jason Moore, had that lovely turn of phrase in his book, where he says that capitalism is a frontier process. Right? So the development of capitalism is the constant genesis of frontiers of different sorts. We have to be able to theorize that. This conversation is about the sorts of qualities of these frontiersness, and can we make distinctions between frontiers and non-frontiers? Raises a whole set of tricky questions, but it seems to me that the advantage of thinking in that way is that it points us, and here your work has been very influential to me, Jonathan, is thinking about aspects that are, of course, commonplace in the social sciences when we think about states, power, authority, but to think about them in slightly different ways, focusing in on this class of expedient brokers, for example, or this type of traffic between the licit and the illicit. It fundamentally turns on questions of the law. It focuses us on law in a new and different way, and how power is exercised. So it seems to me that the appeal of frontiers potentially is that it allows us to revisit these old core social scientific canonical type questions with a rather different lens, thinking rather differently about authority, class, brokerage, networks, the licit and the illicit, the role of the law, rule of law, etc. So that's one. Second, last point, is that I do hope that there are lots of people listening who will take on the demanding task of thinking about frontiers comparatively. I think we now think of the fantastically rich literature in Amazonia, the fantastically rich literature of the Northeast that Dolly has contributed. We have parts of the world that now have fantastically sophisticated, empirically rich, historically deep accounts of frontiers. And I think we're at the point, as in any field, where we can now perhaps learn a lot more about these conceptual questions, borders, states, power, authority, all of that stuff, by thinking about comparative sorts of analyses, comparative frontier dynamics. Seems to me to be a potentially enormously rich area that we can productively pursue. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're now coming to the end. I know Michael has to leave at 7 and we have to finish at 7 anyway. But I think that's a really good note to finish on for Michael about the challenge of comparative research. And I hope we can continue this conversation together, because I think there is a research agenda there to be pursued, and really it would be brilliant to pursue this conversation with you. And just to say that it's really set up the rest of the series in a brilliant way. I think you asked and challenged all of us with concepts, with the empirical cases, and thinking about the methodological challenges. So you've really kind of set the bar very high for the rest of the series. So I'd like to thank you very much. I don't know when either of you sleep, by the way, because your productivity puts the rest of us to shame. But,
well, Dolly clearly doesn't sleep because she's up at 4 a.m. Right now. So there's the evidence that you need, Jonathan.
But thank you very much. I just want to remind everybody of the next seminar, which is on the 10th of November. And Professor Jenny Pierce from LSE is talking about violent state formation and state formation in Latin America. And it's going to be chaired by Jeff Garmany, a colleague of Dolly's at University of Melbourne. So I hope you can make it for that. And thank you very much for coming to the session. And I hope we can continue this conversation. Thank you very much again, Michael and Dolly. Great to see you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Dolly. Wonderful discussion. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.